Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to your newest lesson. So we've got a great lesson for you today. It's on Canadian citizenship. Now, for a lot of your clients, this is a very exciting time in their lives. And for you as immigration consultants, well, as future immigration consultants, this will definitely play a role in your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam. But you're going to see that this is such a pleasure to work in once you are an RCIC. Now, when I say a pleasure to work in, I'm talking about the whole area of helping people obtain their citizenship. So you're going to see that I guess if you take the exam soon, and of course you're going to pass because you're doing all this work, you're working through all these lessons, well, in maybe 6 months, I hope you're starting to see and think about the future, really, because you're going to have clients who you're working with. And in 6 months, so you're going to pass your exam. In the next month or two, you're going to get your business organized. We've got business seminars as well, of course, so maybe you'll join us for those. And you're going to get your first clients. So you're going to help those clients in quite a variety of ways. One of the ways that you're going to help these clients, it might be now or it might be in the future, will be to help them obtain their Canadian citizenship. So for a lot of your clients, this is really such a large reason why they're choosing to come to Canada. Now, if you look at other countries, so if you look at Australia, US, Britain, other places, citizenship takes a very, very, very long time to obtain. But here in Canada, I think it's really one of the great selling points for you when you are discussing Canadian immigration with potential clients, or you're doing a seminar or something like that, so a lot of the clients who are going to come up to you, sometimes they don't really necessarily want to go to Canada. They're usually choosing between a few different countries. And once you start really discussing Canada and all those really great advantages of coming to Canada, well, they will often choose Canada. And obviously they'll hopefully choose to use your services to make their dream a reality. So we're going to discuss this pretty in depth today. There have been changes over the years in Canadian citizenship and who qualifies, who doesn't qualify, etc. We will, of course, touch upon every single little detail to really make sure that you are 1,000,000% prepared for your upcoming exam. And of course, to make sure that you're 1,000,000% prepared for your upcoming clients who are going to want you. They'll be so happy with the services you provided in helping them obtain permanent residency that they'll come back to you and you can help them obtain Canadian citizenship. So let's start right at the beginning here. Now, in order to obtain Canadian citizenship, there are 3 general ways to do this. Obviously, there are exceptions within each one. There's special cases as well. We will, of course, go into detail on all of these throughout this lesson. So the first one, as you can see, is this beautiful little baby, and it was simply born on Canadian soil. So with that, the person is a Canadian citizen. Now the next one has to do with 2 parents who are Canadian, and they have a baby. That baby is born in Australia. All right, well, that baby is also Canadian because he's born on non-Canadian soil, but to Canadian parents. And the third one is the one you're going to deal with the most once you become an RCIC, and that is, of course, somebody who becomes a Canadian citizen really step by step. So let's say this person is South African, and this person comes to you and qualifies for an immigration program. So you do all the work for her, and this person is really happy because she obtains permanent residence. Well, after a while, that person will meet the citizenship requirements and become Canadian. So we're going to discuss each one of these. The one that is the trickiest, of course, is the third one, a permanent resident who meets the citizenship requirements. But of course, they're all incredibly important to understand in the context of your upcoming exam. And you know what? Even in the context of your life as RCICs. So I'm going to show you in the next slide a story, really, about what happened to us when we started working as RCIC. So it's one of our first clients ever, and Canadian citizenship really played a role in this. So that's just in the next slide here. All right, so I'm going to take a step back here and talk about your life as an RCIC. So for a lot of you, I know you're concentrating on the exam, but I really hope you're seeing yourself in the future. You're going to pass the exam, you're going to be successful RCICs. And what's going to happen really is you're going to go to conferences, you're going to have an office, you're going to work really on getting clients. And of course, once you have someone who comes to see you, what you need to do is really assess every little detail about them. So you're taking a look, of course, at their work experience, education, language, ability, intent. Those are the big ones, really, in, of course, real life and, of course, in your exam as well. We talk about this during the seminar a little bit as well. And then what you're doing, really, the beauty of your job is you are trying to find immigration solutions for these people. So what happened to us was we had a client in Mexico who came to us, and she was a bit older, so I won't give you any of the confidential information, of course, but this person was a little bit older, in her 50s, and she wanted to come to Canada. So we were conducting an assessment, of course, of her work experience, her education, language ability, intent, etc. And we were really working through all these details. So she mentioned that she has 2 sons who back then were in their 30s, and she said she would like to bring them as well. So for a lot of you, you know that, of course, a child in their 30s, well, a child, I don't think it's a child anymore, but anyway, somebody in their 30s, they would have to immigrate separately because they simply aren't considered dependent children at that point, regardless of if they live with the parents or anything like that, right? Well, there's, of course, a couple little tiny exceptions that are extremely rare, but that's in the dependent children lesson. So anyways, this was her goal, and we were working, trying to find a solution, really looking at every little detail. And then really, once we were working through this, and we couldn't find an option really that she qualified for, with the exception, of course, of maybe studying and then transitioning, but she didn't want to do that either. So it was a little bit difficult, and we had a meeting with her, and we're chatting to really explore that as an option. We were looking at Quebec immigration as well because she was willing to learn French. So we were looking at that because, of course, my business partner is Quebec, is Midi accredited. And we were looking at all these options here. And then she just said something like this. She said, oh, well, by the way, I was born in Canada. And then for us, we kind of looked at each other, and we were really happy because, of course, that means that this person is already Canadian. So with this person, that's exactly what she did. So she fell into that first category that we were looking at before, where she was born in Canada. And regardless of if she left for 40 years, 50 years, she still qualifies as a Canadian citizen because she was born here. And because of that, her 2 sons qualify as well. So this was such a success story for us. She was so happy because, of course, the procedure is a lot easier, and for her sons as well, they were extremely happy. So for us, as RCICs, that is really one of those amazing situations that you get once in a while, is that you can really help someone quickly. You can help someone to really live their dream. And her dream was to come back to Canada with her sons. They were a little bit older than what you'd expect really for in order to qualify for a permanent residency program. But we found the solution. So on our side, we saved her thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. We saved her years and years and years of obtaining permanent residency, of maybe coming as a student and transitioning. We saved them really a lot of time, a lot of money. And that's really the job that people hire you for as RCICs, is to really make sure that you're exploring all those options for them, that you know what you're talking about, and that, of course, you're helping them reach their goals. So on our side, we were really happy with that. It was just when we were starting as immigration consultants. And for all of you, I always remember these people as well, and I know they're doing really well here in Canada. And for all of you, you're going to have your first clients pretty soon. And I really hope that you enjoy it and see it as such a great experience, the same way that we did. So let's begin with the easiest one, really, which is somebody who is born on Canadian soil. So when someone's born in Canada, they are automatically Canadian citizens. Now there is an extra little piece here though that we need to look at, and of course this doesn't mean that the person gets his or her passport at the hospital. They get their birth certificate, and if they need to apply for a Canadian citizenship certificate, it's pretty straightforward. In most cases, they just need their birth certificate. So, does this sound easy to you? Hopefully, yes, but remember with the exam, with the ICCRC Full Skills Exam, there are always exceptions, and we have to really be experts at the exceptions in order to not get tricked in the exam. So we're going to play a little game here, and I'm going to give you 6 scenarios. And what you're going to do is let us know if the person is automatically a Canadian citizen. So we're going to do this it's testing your knowledge, of course, of the Citizenship Act. So I have the articles for you on the bottom. If you want to pause the video and take a quick look at the Citizenship Act now, you certainly can. Or if you want to keep going and learn what the Citizenship Act is talking about in the context of 6 scenarios, that's perfect. That's exactly what we'll do. Okay, so let's begin with the first one here. Now, what if the parents are in Canada illegally? So remember, with the ICCRC Full Skills Exam, you have a lot of scenarios. And those are stories about people doing things. And of course, we have to see how this relates to an immigration context. So what if the person's parents are in Canada illegally, and then they give birth to that person? Now, is that person then a Canadian citizen automatically? All right, so I'll give you a few minutes to take a look at that and see if you know the answer. Well, what if the parents have TR status but not PR? So for TR status, of course, we know that this means that maybe they were students or maybe something else, and that's fine. All right, so maybe they're working, students, I would suppose even tourists. Well, what's the effect of this status on the person being born in Canada? Okay, so we have another one here. What if the parents are diplomats of another country and in Canada for work? So what if they're stationed here in Canada? Maybe they're the diplomats of Uruguay, and they're based out of Toronto. So their job brought them to Toronto to work in the capacity of a diplomat. All right, what if they were born over Canadian airspace? So I don't really know how common this is, but sometimes you hear about people being born in airplanes. There's like a surprise when the mother is flying. And what if the person is flying from maybe from Japan to London and they're going over Canada? So what happens then if the person is born over Canadian airspace? Are they Canadian citizens then? Okay, what if they're born on a Canadian registered ship? And finally, what if the person is born at a research facility in the far north of Nunavut? So I don't know if you've ever seen those in magazines or in movies or something like that, where it's these research facilities measuring, well, they're doing scientific experiments and environmental experiments and things like that, and they're stationed up north. And what if a person is born there and it's in the far north of Nunavut? Are they Canadian citizens automatically? All right, so I'll give you just 1 extra minute here to work through these. And with these 6 scenarios, I want you to tell me if the person is automatically a Canadian citizen. So you have 45 seconds remaining. All right, your time is up. So let's see how we did here. So what if the parents are in Canada illegally? So maybe they snuck across the border, they overstayed maybe a visa. Well, if they have that kid is a Canadian citizen automatically, even though, of course, the parents are in Canada illegally. What if the child is born over Canadian airspace? Well, again, that makes the child automatically a Canadian citizen. So that example I told you about, I don't know if it's ever really happened, someone flying from Japan to London, for example, and then the person is, the child is born over Canadian airspace, but theoretically, that child would be automatically a Canadian citizen. Now, what if the parents are in Canada as students, let's say, and they have a baby? Well, that baby, again, is automatically a Canadian citizen. What if they're born on a registered Canadian ship? Well, again, that person is automatically a Canadian citizen. And for some people, I know when we talk about this, sometimes in the seminar or even kind of internally when we have clients and that kind of thing, people say, well, yeah, why don't people just board a flight to Canada and just have a baby on the airplane or have a baby on a ship? And it's not exactly possible, or and it really doesn't sound pleasant, of course, either. So what if the parents are diplomats of another country and in Canada for work? Oops, well, I skipped ahead here. So Nunavut, of course, I think that one was an easy one as well. I was trying to trick you a little bit by making you think that it's up north and perhaps unpopulated, but still it's Canada, it's Canadian territory. So that child will be automatically Canadian. And then the tricky one was the last one here, the diplomats. So unfortunately, that's why you have the sad baby here, because the baby doesn't get to be Canadian just yet, I suppose. If the parents are diplomats and they're here in Canada for work, well, that child is not automatically Canadian. So let's take a look now at the second way of obtaining Canadian citizenship, which would be someone who's born on non-Canadian soil. So that means really anywhere outside of Canada, and anywhere, of course, outside of those options that we looked at in the previous slide. But this person's born to Canadian parents, or even one parent. So we've got this section here. Now, this is exactly what's written in your test day data booklet. So if you're using our materials to follow along, your life is going to be a lot easier. So we can see that the second option here is somebody who's born outside of Canada, but they have a parent, or two parents even, who are Canadian citizens. Now, there are a few really important elements in here to acknowledge. Now, the first one here is great because no connection to Canada is needed. So if somebody is born outside of Canada, so when we look at this family on your screen here, they are, the baby is in Australia. And so that baby, if he never goes to Canada, if he says, okay, Canada's too cold for me, there aren't enough beaches, I want to stay here in Australia, and he doesn't have any type of connection to Canada whatsoever, well, even that person is still a Canadian citizen. If this person does not want to be a Canadian citizen, it's okay, but this person has to renounce it. Now, if this person is born and if there's a sad situation and the Canadian parent dies, well, that does not affect the fact that this person is still a Canadian citizen. And then the last point here, adopted children are treated the exact same as if they were born to the actual person. So in the eyes of the government, in the eyes of the IRCC, when they're looking at Canadian citizenship, in this sense, they don't see a difference between someone who is born to a Canadian parent or adopted by a Canadian parent. So we had a really big lesson on adoptions before that we saw. So maybe you worked through that one already. Maybe you're going to work through that one. We're going to explore that in a little bit more detail in that other lesson. So we're talking about these 4 points here because remember, with the exam, it's really all about stories and scenarios and how the law relates to it. So we have to be aware of all these little ones here. Now, personally, I love examples and seeing what we're learning in context. The feedback that we get from people is that they really appreciate the same thing, because sometimes you look at some laws, or you're reading, in this case, maybe you're reading the Citizenship Act, and you're seeing it in a certain way. But it's always really such an advantage to take a look at these laws in the context of real life scenarios. So let's take a look at some examples here. We'll play a little game. So I've got two couples, and each of these couples has a baby. What we're going to do is see if that baby is a Canadian citizen. So when we take a look at this first person, so this the father here is Swedish, and he has no connection to Canada. All right, and then you're probably looking at the chart above, and you're saying, well, this person has no connection to Canada. Does that play a role with this? No, it doesn't. This person has no connection to Canada, and if his wife is the same, well, they're not Canadian citizens or PR or anything really with regard to Canadian immigration, so of course the kid would not be a Canadian citizen. When we say no connection to Canada is needed, what we're talking about is, of course, the child himself or herself. Now, the mother was born in Winnipeg, while her parents were temporary residents in Canada. So the mother here, we could see a situation like we discussed before, where her parents were in Canada studying, and they had a baby while they were here studying. Now, we're asking ourselves, of course, does this mean that the baby here is Canadian? And what do you think the answer is? All right, so I hope you have an idea of an answer, but remember, it's not enough to just guess an answer or to have an idea of the answer or have a certain feeling about the answer. We always need to prove this. So if you have your test day data booklet with you and you're using that, perfect. If you're using the Citizenship Act as well to really make sure that your answer is correct, that's perfect as well. So we can see with this one, it's a very straightforward example, and the mother's Canadian, so the kid is Canadian. All right, let's take a look at our second couple here. So the mother is born in South Africa, but came to Canada and lived here for 10 years and became a Canadian citizen. The father is born in Australia and became a Canadian citizen after marrying his wife. So he married his wife, and then you can see the 3 years over there. That's something we're going to talk about in a little bit here, and that is, of course, the residency requirements that are needed in order to become a naturalized Canadian citizen. We're going to talk about that in the next little section here, but for this one, we're looking at really two Canadian citizens. Now, the baby Canadian then? Because we're looking at two parents who were not born in Canada. So does that have an effect on the baby, even if the baby is, of course, born somewhere else? And the answer is that baby is Canadian at birth as well. So these are two, I think, pretty straightforward examples. We'll look at a couple of more detailed examples in the next slide, because remember, with the exam, it's always about the exceptions. And of course, even when you have clients too, you're always looking at exceptions because, of course, that gives you the key to unlock a particular situation. So let's take a look at one of those really important exceptions that we need to look at, and that is, of course, the first generation limit. So you might see this in the Citizenship Act or on the websites, and it might seem pretty complex, but in reality, it can be simplified into these two bullet points. Basically, if someone was born on or after April 17th, 2009, well, one of the parents has to have become Canadian by option number 1, which is what we saw previously, which is where the parent was born in Canada, or option number 3, which is what we're going to see next, which is someone who was naturalized. And that person has to have been naturalized as a Canadian before the birth of this child. All right, if the child was born abroad before April 17th, 2009, well, then we have the 3 options. So we have the same requirements of the parent that we just talked about, which is option number 1 and option number 3. And we also have option number 2. So maybe the parent was also born abroad to a Canadian. And in this case, because it used to be that if your parent was born abroad to a Canadian, well, then the kid would be Canadian at birth as well. It's a little bit different now. So now it is limited to one generation. So if the parent was born abroad as well, the child would have to have been registered with the Canadian government, even though the person was born abroad. And that would be the requirement of the child having Canadian citizenship. So when we take a look at our couples from before, we need to, of course, take a look and see if this first generation limit plays a role in these situations. So remember, we have the Swedish father. So he has no connection to Canada, no family in Canada. His parents weren't in Canada. Obviously no Canadians in the family or anything like that. It looks like he didn't spend any time in Canada either. Then we have the mother. So she was born in Winnipeg, while her parents were temporary residents in Canada. Now, again, we have to ask ourselves, first of all, is she Canadian? And the answer is yes, as we saw before. So when we saw people who were born in Canada, remember that the parents can be in Canada, even illegally. They can be in Canada, and the child would be born on Canadian soil. So that would make the child a Canadian citizen. Well, her parents were temporary residents in Canada. So that means, of course, that she's born in Canada at that time, and she is a Canadian citizen. So for the child, does this affect the child's Canadian citizenship? And the answer is no. That child is Canadian anyways, because as we can see with the first bullet point, it doesn't really matter when the child was born in this case, but the parent was born in Canada. Now with the second couple here, we have the mother who was born in South Africa, became a Canadian citizen, so became a naturalized Canadian citizen after living in Canada for 10 years. Now, you know that, of course, the requirements aren't 10 years. It's 3 years, really. But maybe she took her time a little bit with it. And the father was a bit quicker. So he met his 3 years, and then he applied for and received his Canadian citizenship. So in this case, you have two Canadian citizens who were not born in Canada. So does the first generation limit affect the Canadian citizenship or potential Canadian citizenship of the child? Well, in this case, the answer is no. That child is Canadian citizen as well. And let's even pretend that he was born in 2000. So this is going to play a role in the next area that we're looking at, because there are exceptions even to this first generation limit. So with this first generation limit, there are a couple of little exceptions, and I think they're pretty rare, but certainly in a scenario in your exam, or when you're doing the exercises with us, or maybe you're doing the exam simulations with us, well, maybe you are going to face one of these scenarios where it's a Canadian citizen. So one of the parents is a Canadian citizen who's employed abroad as a crown servant. So we remember this from another lesson where we talked about exactly what is a crown servant. It's someone with a diplomat-like job. So they're sent abroad under the Canadian government to do some official kind of government business. Well, you can see with the subpoint here, if the parent's parent was in the same position, so that means the grandparent, if that grandparent was abroad and working as a crown servant, well, in that case, the first generation limit would not apply either, because a really easy rule for you is when you're looking at crown servants, and we saw this in the residency requirements lesson as well, where we talked about crown servants, and really the easiest thing to do with crown servants is just pretend they're on Canadian soil. It's the easiest way to think of that, so you don't get tricked with anything there. Then we have the last point here. So if not becoming Canadian in this situation means that the person will be stateless, then of course the person would be granted his Canadian citizenship or her Canadian citizenship. But there is a little add-on at the end there. It's someone who's always been stateless. So remember, of course, it can't be somebody who has the option to gain Australian citizenship or South African citizenship or whatever, and then they choose not to. So it's not that type of situation, of course. So let's see the example here. So we have this couple with their cute little baby. And remember, the mother is born in South Africa, and she became a naturalized Canadian citizen. And the father is born in Australia and became a Canadian citizen, well, a naturalized Canadian citizen as well, because he married the mother. And then you can sort of deduce that he was probably sponsored as a spouse, came to Canada, met his residency requirements, did his 3 years for Canadian citizenship, and then became a Canadian citizen. Well, they have their little baby, and of course these two are Canadian citizens. So the child, as we saw before, is a Canadian citizen as well, and let's call him Jack. So Jack was born in 2000 in Australia. Well, later on, when Jack becomes an adult and has a little baby as well, the question really is, so Jack, of course, is going to maintain his Canadian citizenship. But this is the big question here, and this is something that can certainly come up in the exam. It's something that, if you're doing the simulations from us, well, there's a question similar to this in one of them, and I think it's a really good question because it's testing you on your knowledge of Canadian citizenship, but a couple levels down. So Jack goes back to Australia and he has a baby in that country. Is that baby a Canadian citizen? All right, I'm going to give you 30 little seconds to think about this, and I want you to take a look especially at the highlighted portion of the box up there. Okay, so in understanding if Jack's baby is a Canadian citizen, even though that baby was born outside of Canada, we really need to ask ourselves 3 questions. All right, so was one of Jack's parents employed as a crown servant when Jack was born abroad? So were either his mother or his father in another country as Canadian diplomats, for example, when Jack was born abroad? So, and in this case, the example is Australia. Okay, and this, just from this quick little scenario, it looks like a no, but in the exam, well, there might be some little details about that in there. And the other one, I think the really tricky area is to take a step even further up the family tree, which is when we take a look at the grandparents. So was one of Jack's grandparents employed as a crown servant when Jack's parents were born abroad? Now, in this case, if the answer was yes, well, it really changes everything because that means that the first generation limit would not apply here. And would Jack's child be stateless if he doesn't qualify for Canadian citizenship? So we don't really know because we're obviously not experts on Australian citizenship, but we have some ideas anyways of the answer being either yes or no. So let's take a look here. Now, if that answer is yes, well, we have a very happy Canadian baby. And with this, I mean the answer to any of those questions. Now, if the answer is no, well, in that case, that Canadian citizenship certainly is not automatically granted because, of course, of the first generation limit. All right, so I hope that this story helped you to understand what the first generation limit means, the exceptions to it, and of course I think seeing it in a real life context like we're doing really helps to simplify the idea. So the third option we're going to explore today has to do with people who, I would call it step-by-step citizenship. So it's people who become a PR and then meet the citizenship requirements. Now, for a lot of your clients in the future, this is exactly what they're going to do. And for a lot of people as well, it's such a, I would say it's such a beautiful bonus about choosing to come to Canada because a lot of your clients, they're not necessarily interested in Canada. Often they're choosing between going to Canada, Australia, Spain, or wherever really, different countries. But this is such a great opportunity for people to obtain another citizenship. And we'll talk about these requirements here, but you're going to see it is just so fantastic. And I'm on the business side and just personally too, I think it's so accepting and welcoming of Canada to offer citizenship. So I wouldn't say easily, but very clearly, and I think it doesn't really take all that long either. So this is called, we've been talking about this quite a bit today already, and it's called naturalization. So that's the third option that we are looking at here. And the starting requirements are pretty straightforward. Essentially, a person would have to be at least 18 years old and hold permanent resident status. So we took a look at people who are born in Canada and people who are born abroad to Canadians. And those are very different strategies, really. Well, different strategies, different options, really, when a person is becoming Canadian, because the procedure is extremely different. Because essentially those people were born and then they're already Canadian, but they just have to obtain their proof of Canadian citizenship. For these other people who become naturalized, it's quite a different process because they are essentially applying to become Canadian citizens after meeting all these requirements. So it's interesting because you might think of it as similar to when people apply for PR. So people who, let's say, under the Federal Skilled Worker Program. So and they would have, the minimum requirements, the educational requirement, the work experience requirement, the points, of course, the language ability, and that type of thing. And this is somewhat similar to that, just in the fact that they have to meet certain requirements in order to obtain Canadian citizenship. Well, the first one is pretty simple, 18 PR. And regardless of the way that they obtained PR. So it could be somebody who married a Canadian, it can be someone who came to Canada as a refugee, someone who came to Canada as an investor, a skilled worker, anything really. A PR is a PR. All right, so we've got this really important one here. And I know when you're reading through your material, or you're going to the government website and taking a look at all that information there, or in your class when you took your diploma, often people will say, okay, 3 out of 5 years, 3 out of 5 years, 3 out of 5 years. Well, it's not that easy. So we took a look at this when we talked about residency requirements for permanent residents, and we saw that was 2 out of 5 years. And we saw that there's a lot of exceptions in there, and it can be pretty tricky. Well, citizenship is a little bit easier when we're looking at residency requirements, but there are some tricky little details in there. So we're going to take a look at that in the next slide, of course. Income tax. So, of course, people have to prove they were in Canada for those 3 out of 5 years. There are exceptions that we'll take a look at, but part of that proof has to do with income taxes and filing income taxes for each of those 3 years. What if the person was unemployed? That's okay, but the person still has to file income tax. What if the person was a PR who was a full-time student? That's okay too, but the person, of course, has to have filed his or her taxes for those 3 years that we're using. And we're going to see, if you're looking at, you should be watching this on the website, of course, on fullskillsexamprep.com, and you'll see some court cases on the bottom here. There's a great one about somebody who was applying for Canadian citizenship, but the proof was a little bit vague. So the application was rejected, and that's a great one to show you really the standard of proof that's needed in obtaining Canadian citizenship. All right, if the person is between 18 and 54, well, there are language requirements that have to be met. Again, it seems like you might think that's an easy area to look at. We're going to talk about that just a little bit more in detail, because it's not as easy as the Federal Skilled Worker Program, for example, or a different economic program, where often they'll just say the language requirements are CLB 7 or whatever the CLB is. In this one, it's a little bit different because there are some exceptions to taking a language exam. So we'll talk about those in 2 slides, actually. And a citizenship test. Now, if a person does not pass that citizenship test, there is, of course, a second opportunity to take it, and that oath of citizenship. And of course, if anybody has a disability, remember, of course, the minister has a lot of power in immigration in general. And in particular, this is pretty clearly shown in the Citizenship Act that if a person has a physical or mental disability, and because of that disability, the person cannot fulfill one of these requirements. And I'm not talking about the residency requirement. I'm talking about the three that we've talked about over here. So language requirements, citizenship test, or the oath of citizenship. Then the person can, that requirement can be waived for this person. So let's say, for example, a person is maybe deaf. And of course, if someone is deaf, they'll have a very difficult time in the language exam. Well, in that case, the person, that requirement for citizenship can be waived due to compassionate reasons. So let's dig into those residency requirements a little bit here. So we talked about this in the residency requirements lesson for PRs. And for citizenship, it's a little bit, well, some areas are similar, some areas are a little bit different. But again, we're splitting time into the residency time requirements, so which is, of course, the amount of time that the person has been in Canada. And you could see the second one more as geography. So where was this person? If the person was not in Canada, is there an exception that is applied to this person's citizenship residency requirements? All right, so let's take a look over here. So we've got the general idea that we need to, the general requirements really that we need this person to meet. And that's the 3 out of 5 years. All right, there's no minimum amount of days per year required in this either. So that's really great. That's something that you might notice that when you're reading through citizenship, it changed a few times over the last 5 years, I'd say. But of course, this is the requirement now. And if it changes, of course, we'll update everything again. But it looks like it's not going to change for quite some time. And I think even for your clients, even for, I know a lot of the people in Full Skills Exam Prep, when we meet people at the seminars and conferences, and even we work together with a lot of RCICs who took the course. And I know a lot of you are PRs yourselves, and you're probably going to obtain your citizenship pretty soon. Well, those 3 years out of 5, it's just fantastic. So there's a great little bonus in here too, I would say, and that is that you can count up to 1 year of the time as a TR. So let's say somebody's here as a student for 2 years and then PR for 2 years. Perfect. That person would meet those residency requirements because the 2 years as a TR, so as a student or visitor or worker or combination of all of those or any of them, would count up to a maximum of 1 year. All right, and then we've got the crown servant. So that's we've talked about this quite a bit. Again, it's a tricky little area. I don't think it really happens too much in real life where you'll have somebody who is working as a crown servant. But again, in the exam, it certainly can come up. So obviously, as we discussed before when we were talking about people born to Canadian citizens outside of Canada, we talked about crown servants. And remember the trick. If somebody is a crown servant, just pretend that they're in Canada. That's the easiest thing to do. And of course, if somebody is working as a crown servant overseas, now this is of course while they're permanent residents, then that person, if the person's spouse or kids or family is with them, well, that time again counts towards their citizenship requirements. And also, of course, their PR requirements, as we saw in the previous lesson. All right, so when we're looking at language exams as it relates to Canadian citizenship, we can see that there are 3 ways of proving language ability. Now, the first method is pretty straightforward, and it's simply proving your language level by showing the results of a language exam. Now here you can see it's a CLB4. So we've talked about CLB and how it correlates with different language exams quite a bit in the other lessons here. If you're using your test day data booklet, you've got, of course, the perfect page for linking language results with the CLB. Now, it's a CLB4, and another really fantastic part of this with the government when they're deciding on what the language level should be is that, first of all, CLB4 is pretty low, so I think it opens the doors for a lot of people. And what's even better is that it's only listening and speaking. So reading and writing are not required. So this is obviously pretty fantastic. Now, the language exams that are accepted are the same as immigration, really. So TEF, IELTS, CELPIP. When you have people who immigrate to Quebec, though, there's different language exams that could potentially be used. So for immigration to Quebec, we'll see this in another lesson later on when we talk about Quebec a little bit more. But Quebec immigration uses a variety of French language exams, including DALF-DEF, le TCF and le TCFQ. So with that, so when somebody uses those results in order to obtain their Quebec immigration, well, then they can use those results for their citizenship as well. Now, the second method deals with certification. So if somebody came to Canada and studied at a university, for example, in English, well, that's fine. That certification would be accepted. Now, this same certification could be accepted if the person studied outside of Canada. And I've got an example for you below there. And this is a really important to think about when we are looking at proving language ability. So somebody who completes an ESL course, so maybe they go to Australia and study English for 6 months, that is not accepted. However, if somebody goes to Australia and takes let's say a 2-year master's degree in accounting, and that accounting master's degree is taught in English, well, that is accepted. And the third method is completion of a language program. So this isn't just any language program, it's pretty specific, the programs that can be used for this. If you've ever heard of LINK, so LINK is, I think it's the most widely known government-funded language training program. And it's available pretty much everywhere, even though often it's just, in some provinces, it's just called something else. But it's basically the government paying people to, or paying for people to improve their English. Now, if somebody graduates from one of these programs or completes one of these programs at a CLB4 level, well, then that can be used as proof of language ability for Canadian citizenship. And of course, if just that little note on the bottom, again, if a person has some sort of disability, like maybe someone's deaf, for example, or something like that, of course, this language requirement can be waived. But of course, they would have to prove this. All right, so let's talk about the Canadian Citizenship Test. So all of you are getting ready for a big exam, of course, and we just talked about the language exam that people need to take, or certain people need to take, I guess, in order to qualify for Canadian citizenship. Well, there is a Canadian Citizenship Test that the person has to pass as well. Now, for some of you, you may have taken this test yourself, actually, in becoming Canadian citizens, or for some of you, maybe you are permanent residents right now, and you're going to take this exam later on. Well, that's fine. So this is a written test, and it covers all these areas of Canadian, I would call it Canadian knowledge, really. So Canadian society, obviously the rights of citizens as compared to permanent residents, democratic society, I like this part over here, ways to take part in your society. I think that's just fantastic. I've got the link for you on the bottom here, of course. There is the study guide for this. And for your clients, it's actually not that difficult of an exam. If they read that manual from the Canadian government, they'll pass. It's a lot easier, of course, than your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. So the reason we talked about this, of course, is just that you know, in the context of your exam, a person certainly has to take this citizenship test. Well, this is where it gets really interesting. And what if a person fails this test? Well, they probably won't be too happy. And for you as their consultant, well, you're not going to be happy either. But they'll be rescheduled for another exam. So if somebody fails the exam the first time, and then they will automatically be rescheduled for another. And what if that person fails that second test? Well, that is, of course, going to be a pretty unfortunate situation, but really they'll have a hearing with an officer. Now, that hearing is pretty intense. It's 30 to 90 minutes long. And in that hearing, the officer will assess the person's knowledge of Canada. The officer will assess the person's language ability and residency. Now, when we say the officer will assess the person's language ability, this doesn't mean that this procedure replaces the language exam procedure that we saw, the language exam requirements that we saw before. So remember, the language requirements are pretty clear. We saw the 3 ways in which a person can qualify to meet those requirements. If a person cannot get that language score or cannot get to that level of the LINK program, for example, or something like that, that cannot be replaced with an officer interview. However, if the person does not get the score needed on the citizenship test in order to qualify for Canadian citizenship, well, then we can get into this procedure here, where the person would have a hearing with an officer. In this hearing as well, the officer is, of course, making sure that the person has met those residency requirements as well. Okay, for Canadian citizenship, again, is there anybody who does not have to meet these requirements? And the answer is yes. So let's say we have these 2 people here, and they're both applying for Canadian citizenship. Well, if a person applied when he, in this case he, was between 18 and 54 years old, well, that person needs to meet those language and citizenship test requirements. Now, if a person is 55 and over when he applied, well, then that person does not have to meet those requirements. All right, so this is really interesting in the context of your exam, well, even in the context of the clients that you'll get, because personally, I've never really met someone who is applying for citizenship who does not have the language requirements, because remember, the language requirements are pretty low with this. But it just saves a little bit of time, I guess, for people, or maybe some people who are 55 and over, maybe they would be really stressed out at the language exam or the citizenship exam. So maybe that's why the government does not require this for people who are 55 and over. In the context of your exam, there's a pretty tricky little area, and we have this in one of the simulation questions, and that is for somebody who applies when he's 54, and then maybe he turns 55 right after he applies, and the application has not been processed yet. Well, that person, or I'll ask you, actually, does that person have to meet the citizenship test requirements and or the language requirements? And I'll give you just 10 little seconds here to think about this. All right, well, the answer is yes, because the person was between 18 and 54 when he applied, regardless of his or her age right now. All right, so let's talk about the procedures that a person takes in obtaining Canadian citizenship. So we looked at the requirements, and it's always important when you are getting ready for your exam to take a step back and look at those procedures. So we have a person here, and you can see she is excited and happy, and she has her application in her hand. Well, that application has to verify that she has met those main requirements that we saw for citizenship. So we've got the PR status. Now remember, of course, a person has to have PR status. in order to obtain Canadian citizenship. She has to, of course, maintain PR status all the way through the citizenship process as well. Now, the person has to have met Canadian Citizenship Residency. So those requirements are, as we saw in what we saw about maybe 20 minutes ago in the lesson here. And it's important to remember that, of course, permanent residency requirements, in terms of the residency requirement itself, it's pretty different from the citizenship requirements. So don't get the two confused. Make sure that you differentiate between the two very clearly in the context of questions that can come up in your exam. If you are purchasing the materials that we have, well, we have questions on exactly this. So it's really going to help you to prepare to make sure that there aren't any surprises on the big day. All right, the income tax requirements. So remember, that's part of proving residency. We have the language and citizenship test that is needed. Of course, the citizenship test wouldn't be complete when the person is submitting the application, but the language requirements, so whether it's a test or whether it's one of the other requirements that have been met, well, that needs to be proven in this application. And of course, we have to make sure that the person is, of course, not inadmissible for citizenship. Now, once the person has met all of these requirements, well, it's pretty straightforward. It goes into a perfect application that gets sent to Sydney CPC. It's a paper application. It'll go by regular mail or by courier. Of course, for you as RCICs, you're going to make sure it goes by courier because you need to be able to track the package, make sure that someone received it. And of course, even with a courier, you can know the person who received it actually. So it's part of your requirements as an RCIC. Now, once it's there and it's received, you're going to have an officer, and the officer has, you can see the officer over here. He's happy and working hard. I mean, I've found that the officers are pretty happy people. They work really hard, and he's got a lot of applications that he is working through. So with this person, he is going to verify everything really in there. So he's verifying the information presented in the application itself. If there is missing information, well, it kind of depends on what the missing information is. They might request that missing information or simply return the application. They return the application, of course, when the person makes a mistake in, maybe if the person dates the application in the future, or if it's more than 3 months in the past that the person dated the application, or maybe the person just didn't submit something. Well, all of those can mean that the officer will simply return the application to the person, and that person has to, of course, reapply. For you as RCICs, I mean, this isn't really going to be an issue because part of your job is making sure, of course, that the application is perfect. Okay, well, the officer can always request additional information. So information on top of those minimum requirements of citizenship. So maybe the officer has a suspicion about something. Well, the officer can certainly request the person to submit fingerprints, for example, or maybe the officer wants some clarification on something else. Well, they can certainly request additional information. That's part of their job. Just as your job as RCICs is to be thorough, well, their job is the same. And they need to be thorough in making sure that, of course, they're not giving citizenship to someone who simply doesn't deserve it. Okay, so if everything checks out, they'll invite the person to the citizenship test. Now you can see those numbers, 18 to 54. I think we know what that means because we just saw it, right? So that, of course, means if the person is between 18 and 54, well, they'll be invited to the citizenship test. After that citizenship test, of course, there will be the citizenship ceremony, assuming that the person, of course, passes the citizenship test. So for all of you, just a bit of a personal story. I'm not sure if all of you have ever been to a citizenship ceremony. Well, you'll certainly be invited to a few because you're going to have clients who you help come to Canada. Maybe even you have clients who come to Canada as a student and then you help them transition to permanent residence, and then eventually you help them transition to Canadian citizenship. And your clients are so happy with the service that you've provided. So often they'll invite you to their citizenship ceremony. I've been to a few now, and I think it's amazing. I remember the first one I ever went to was for one of my colleagues here, and it was amazing. I was sitting in the back, and there was a the people in front of me were people receiving citizenship, and there was one person in like African garb, like wearing really beautiful, colorful African clothes. The person next to her was an Asian man. I think I heard him speaking Chinese, so I think he was from China. The person next to him was someone from maybe the Middle East, and that person next to him was a person from maybe Scandinavia or something, and it was beautiful. It was just every person, every type of person in the world really was there, and I think it is just so representative of Canada. And becoming a citizen is really a huge step, of course. I think it's really the biggest step in becoming Canadian. And it's, I don't know, I think it's a beautiful ceremony. So if you ever have the opportunity to go to one, I would really take that opportunity. You get to really see the work that people do in becoming Canadian. And of course, I mean, people were crying in the ceremony. People were there with their whole families. Everyone's really, really happy. So if you became a Canadian citizen yourself, I think you know what a big day it is. And if you haven't become Canadian yourself, or if you were born in Canada like me, it's a really great opportunity to see how beautiful the work that you do is. All right, so just back to the citizenship process here. Now, just a few notes, because these scenarios can certainly pop up on the exam. So for a person who applies for Canadian citizenship, now when the IRCC receives that application, well, the person can leave Canada. That is perfectly fine. People have business trips that they need to take. People need to go visit family. That's perfectly fine, and I think the IRCC understands that. However, remember that the citizenship test is not provided outside of Canada. An interview or hearing is not provided outside Canada either, and the citizenship ceremony itself is only provided in Canada. Now, remember that a person needs to remain a PR all the way through to the oath of citizenship. So if a person loses PR after submitting the application, and maybe the application is approved, they take a citizenship test and they pass that test, and then maybe the day before they're going to go take their oath of citizenship at the citizenship ceremony, they lose their PR. Well, that person obviously isn't eligible for Canadian citizenship. Now, let's say a person is traveling outside of the country and needs to reschedule their appointment with the IRCC. That is, of course, perfectly fine. Okay, and just on another little side note for your clients, remember, becoming a Canadian citizen is, of course, a fantastic day in someone's life, really. People, our clients, for example, they often say it's as important as some other big events in their lives, such as graduating from university or maybe even getting married. Well, for your clients in the future, you really need to make sure that they obtain their Canadian citizenship the minute that they can. You've got some news articles at the bottom of this video, and you can see that people qualify for citizenship all the time, but they just never get around to applying for it. Or some people, they just automatically assume that they're Canadian. And there's one news story at the bottom of the video here. Of course, remember to watch these videos on our website on fullskillsexamprep.com, because you get all those news, well, all the relevant links as well. And there's one news article at the bottom that was somebody who grew up in Canada for, I think, 60 years. And just never applied for Canadian citizenship, even though she had lived her whole life here. So those types of situations are situations that you really, really, really need to make sure your clients avoid. And you can do it. I mean, all the knowledge that you're obtaining from your studies certainly helps you to help your clients, of course, to avoid any tricky situations. All right, so this is a pretty important question to answer as well, and that is what happens after a person's citizenship application is refused. So there's a lot of kind of situations that could extend from this. Now, people often ask if the person loses PR as well. Obviously not. The person does not lose PR if their citizenship application is refused. I think it depends, though, the reason why their citizenship application is refused. Let's say they apply for citizenship, and when the government is checking everything out, well, they find that the person lied on their PR application. Well, in that case, the person would likely lose PR under misrepresentation. So that is why, even in a real life context, when you're working as an RCIC, you're going to have people who want to lie on their application, or they'll ask you, oh, why don't I just say this? The government will never know. Well, that's a horrible idea. And the reason why, of course, is because, I mean, it's not Canadian style. They're going to get likely refused on their PR application. And even if they're accepted for PR and nobody uncovers this lie, well, when they apply for citizenship, that is going to be quite a situation. And when you think of this person is going to have to look over his shoulder for his whole life, because who knows when the government will uncover whatever this person lied about, and it's just not a good way to live life. And of course, for your job as RCICs, you are, of course, legally bound and ethically bound to tell the truth, and I think it's pretty easy to do. And part of the reason why is simply because, hey, it's Canada, it's Canadian style, and when people go and lie about these things, it's going to affect them later on for sure. So with this, what happens after a Canadian citizenship application is refused? Well, the person can simply apply again. If it's refused because maybe the person didn't fill in something properly, or maybe you have a client coming to you and they're saying, okay, this was refused, and you notice that they made some mistakes in the application, it's fine. You can simply redo the application. You'd have to resubmit everything. The government's not going to keep anything. Well, I mean, they won't dig into their files to get your language scores again or anything like that. So you make sure you include everything as if it is a brand new application, of course. Now, if the person wants to file for leave for judicial review, well, that is maybe something to explore as well. They would have 30 days from the date on the refusal letter to apply. And of course, remember, that means that there has to be a mistake on the government's side, really, in assessing this person's application. I would say that in a real life context with immigration consultants, that I think 99% of the time, the immigration consultant will instead make sure that the person simply submits a new application, because it's easier, and if there was a mistake, there was a mistake. Okay, well, let's talk about inadmissibility now. So inadmissibility touches upon every little topic really in immigration, and of course citizenship as well. So with inadmissibility, now if a person meets those requirements that we discussed before, so they meet the residency requirements, they meet the language requirements, they filed their taxes and everything like that. Well, even if a person, I put in brackets meeting those requirements, because the person might superficially seem to meet those requirements, but in reality they don't, because even if they meet everything, if they've been here for a long time and they're contributing to Canadian society, etc., well, they wouldn't be able to obtain their citizenship if the PR requirements are no longer met, okay, or if the status is in doubt. So let's say that an officer is investigating this person for fraud, or even if the person receives a removal order. Well, regardless of if the person's been living in Canada for a long time, if he meets the language requirements, etc., that person would not be qualified to receive Canadian citizenship. Okay, when we are adding up the time that a person spends in Canada, well, remember that, of course, if a person's in prison or on parole or on probation, that time does not count towards citizenship. And the person cannot apply during this time. So let's say a person's been living in Canada for 4 years. You have a couple questions like this in the simulations that we have as well, where a person maybe lived in Canada for 4 years and was a law-abiding citizen, paid their taxes, etc., and then went to prison. And in prison, the person applied for citizenship right away. Well, that person would obviously not be able to obtain their Canadian citizenship, because they simply are not allowed to apply during this time. All right, if they are pretty much anything having to do with the Citizenship Act. So let's say that they're getting charged with a violation of the Citizenship Act, or if they're appealing it or anything like that, well, they cannot apply for Canadian citizenship at that point. Okay, even if they have if they've been charged with an indictable crime, and this, of course, is inside or outside Canada, especially those Article 34 through 36 elements, war crimes, etc., and of course, an offense under the Citizenship Act. So if a person, basically, if a person's in trouble with the law, they cannot apply for citizenship. And of course, if a person already had their Canadian citizenship revoked, well, they can't apply for Canadian citizenship again for 10 years. So there's a bar on that. And of course, misrepresentation. Now, if a person already applied for Canadian citizenship and they misrepresented on their application, well, they might have even had their PR revoked at that time if they misrepresented on their Canadian citizenship application. Because remember, if a person misrepresents on their PR application, even if it's years later and the government finds out, well, that person can certainly lose their PR. And of course, if a person applies for citizenship and misrepresents himself, well, it's the same idea, right? That a person would obviously not obtain Canadian citizenship. They might even lose their PR, and they cannot apply for Canadian citizenship again for 5 years. All right, and of course, during the hearing. Now, we talked about hearings before a little bit, and if the officer has a hearing with the person and the person cannot demonstrate that CLB4 or the knowledge of Canada during that hearing, and of course the officer would verify the residency requirements in there as well, well, then that person simply cannot apply for Canadian citizenship. The person does not qualify for Canadian citizenship. If you work in the language exam world, you'll know that a CLB4 is really low. In some ways, it's someone who can maybe kind of order a cup of coffee, but not really have a conversation. So if a person cannot demonstrate that level to the immigration officer, then they simply, in that case, in the case of if they have a hearing, well, they'll be in a little bit of trouble. All right, so of course it's really important to continue reading. I hope this video has given you a good insight into Canadian citizenship as it applies to your upcoming ICCRC Full Skills Exam. And you certainly have the Citizenship Act that you can read through. I would say that these 3 links here, they're linked just below the video on our website, of course. I would say that these are the big ones to work through if you want to go over some more of the material here. So the Citizenship Act is pretty thorough as well. It's a little bit tricky though. You're going to have to make sure that you are keeping it updated by yourself. Of course, if you're using our material, the test day data booklet is up to date, of course, and it is ready for you, really. So if you've worked through the video, if you have your test day data booklet in front of you, and you've been following along together, you're going to be very thoroughly covered in this area. If you want to review a little bit more, go to the IRCC website. It's a very thorough website. I think it's very readable as well. And then, of course, try to apply this knowledge into the exam simulations that we offer. And that's going to really help you move towards conquering this next step, which is, of course, Canadian citizenship. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and of course, it was our pleasure to make it. So be sure to visit our website. We have tons and tons and tons of great resources for you as RCICs. Now, these days, we've got a lot of people who it's funny because in this video, we're talking about people going from PR to citizenship, and often for you, when you start working as RCICs, it's going to be people going from TR to PR to citizenship. And it's interesting because we at Full Skills Exam Prep do something similar, because we help you go from being a student to preparing for your ICCRC Full Skills Exam to passing your exam to becoming RCICs. And then, of course, we're there to help you after you become an RCIC as well. So we have tons and tons of partnership opportunities for you. All the people we've partnered up with, they love it. So the partnerships that we have here from English Exam Prep, IDP IELTS, the CPD courses we offer, and of course Scotiabank, they're really happy to help you become a better RCIC and to organize your business. And on my side, I play a role in this as well. So be sure to stay tuned to our website, and of course take advantage of these partnership opportunities. They're all really there waiting for you. So with English Exam Prep, we offer IELTS training for your clients. IDP IELTS, of course, puts on the IELTS exam itself. RCIC CPD is our CPD branch. So in these videos, we're helping you pass your IELTS, your ICCRC Full Skills Exam. But the CPD courses really help you to gain a ton of practical knowledge to help you as RCICs. And of course, Scotiabank is a very important partner for you to get in touch with as well, because I don't know, we use them, and it's really, I think they're extremely professional, and it makes our life quite a bit easier to have that part set already. So for all of you, all of our partners want to work with you. I'm hoping that you're going to work with us as well. And keep up the good work. You're just about there. All right, so have a good day. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you in the next few videos, because we're going to go over a few questions.